Lesson planning is one of those necessary evils in the world of teaching. It allows teachers to be prepared, but can often be one of those pesky things you have to do during the week that takes a lot of your time and is not always necessary, or so you think. Lesson planning is super important to teachers. It allows teachers to have a plan, and it allows them to be prepared, and also for them as well as the students to know what to expect. It's always best to overplan. It's always better to have too much than to have something come up and have to think on your feet, which always presents something that's not always well thought out and probably not as effective either. We've established that lesson planning is very important. One of the good observations that I saw in another module when watching a video was a teacher that gave her students extra time each day to ask questions. This allowed her students to catch up on work that they maybe had fallen behind on, to get some extra clarification on, a term or activity that they were not sure about. It also allowed the teacher to see where her students were and if they needed extra attention in that area, or if she needed to come back and teach the majority of the class that lesson over again, or think of a different way to teach that lesson to better help her students. It's also important to plan for differentiated instruction. All too often, we have to think on our feet when one of our students isn't understanding or isn't being reached in the way that they should be or that is most effective. So if we plan for differentiation ahead of time, this limits our having to think on our feet, and it allows students to have a better plan for their most effective learning. The more you plan, the more prepared you are as a teacher, and the less room for error that we have during the day. It makes for an easier day for us, and as well as the students. When teachers aren't frantic, students are less likely to be frantic. Another piece of advice that I got during the lesson planning process was don't be afraid to stray away from the lesson plan. The lesson plan isn't the be-all, end-all of the day. It's more of a guideline to look at, when you're thinking about what's coming next. It's not a script that's written down that you have to follow to a T. Another important aspect of lesson planning is flexibility. There's never enough time to do everything that we've planned. I'm sure all teachers have been through this. It's okay if you don't get everything done. The most important thing is that the students are learning and your teaching is effective, even if it takes a little bit longer. Another piece of advice that I got was not to plan too far in advance. Because of these time restraints and students' ability to get sidetracked, lessons can become null and void after a few days. So it's best to plan probably a week in advance and reassess in the middle of the week to see if you need to change your lesson plan. Visuals are extremely important in kindergarten, and especially in the environment that I work in, which is an immersion setting. This helps students to grasp the new language that they're learning and helps them to gain more comprehension about what's being taught to them. It's really important to plan these visuals into your lessons as well. Also another aspect of being prepared, and it allows you not to be running around the room or grabbing for your iPad to come up with a Google image of what you're talking about. Switching it up is also a really important part of being a kindergarten teacher. Kindergartners don't have the long attention span. It's important to plan many different approaches during your lesson, just in case. I like to break up my lessons, having 5 to 10 minutes of instruction and asking the students questions and then letting them break off into solo work or group work, and then coming back to as a class and doing more instruction, and then they break off and do an activity or something like that. Just keeps the lesson not boring for them, and it keeps them interactive when they're able to break out and do stuff on their own and be interactive and get to work with their classmates. And I think planning a lot of different types of activities is important too. We never know how our students are going to receive something on a given day, so something might not be catching with them, they might not think it's fun. So all these sorts of problems that we have in the middle of a day gives us a plan B just in case we're not being as effective as we could be. Finally, I think another important part of the lesson planning process and just the daily routine is to check in with your students during your lessons. Not all teachers, I think, can say at a given moment where their students stand in the learning process. I think it's important to always check in with your students, asking all of your students questions, no matter what their level is. I think it's almost even more important to be asking the students that are at a low level these questions so that they can think through the problems and get help if they're not understanding. I think teachers often plan end of the lesson assessments and not very many middle of the lesson assessments or check-ins. I think that the after lesson assessments are great and they're able to tell you where your students stand, but I think the middle of the lesson check-ins are even more important because they're able to gauge whether your student is learning during the learning process. If you can catch a student that isn't grasping the content during that time, you can switch up your teaching method and hopefully allow them to grasp the concept before you're done with the lesson. For my grammar lessons in Spanish immersion, I often do, for my after lesson assessments, I often do a grammar sort. This is an easy way to see if the students are understanding and grasping the concepts that I've taught during the grammar lesson. They simply have to sort these words into categories, and it allows me to see that they have a good grasp on what's going on during my lesson. This is an example of one of those grammar sorts. This would be the grammar sort for a noun lesson. What is a noun? And this just goes through a few examples of what nouns are. Nouns are people and things. In this case, students have to cut out these words right here and then cut out the titles, the categories, and then they have to place the words in the correct category. Once they're done with that, they are able to put away their words for the day, and then they bring out their words again the next day when we do a follow-up lesson or to get extra practice before we do the next lesson. Here's another example for the nouns. Nouns are places and people. So just another example of those grammar sorts. And this would be an article agreement. So those are some of the examples of the things that I use as end of the lesson assessments to see if they're grasping the concepts that we're teaching. This was a video that I observed, and it really put an emphasis on repetition and consistency in lesson planning. I think for kindergartners that is an especially important part of the lesson planning process. I think it's important for their learning as well as their classroom management and their behavior to have consistent lesson plans for them to know what to expect while they're learning. For this lesson, she focused on the letter of the week, so the students know that they're going to be looking for the letter of the week, they're going to be looking for examples of the letter, they're going to have to form the sound, they're going to have to point out words and tell their friends, and they're going to have to identify as well as read. So I think that them having that consistency is really important and allows them to get more out of their learning process when they know what to expect and they know what they're looking for. Another important part of lesson planning that I have observed is the emphasis on Common Core standards, or whatever standards you are complying with. I think all too often it's easy to get so laser focused on the one standard. While that's important and you want to make sure that your students are picking up on the standards and meeting those goals, it's important. Overall, I see a really big need for me to do lesson planning and to take the time and do it correctly and in depth during my teaching time. I think that it helps to be prepared and it helps to lessen the error that could happen during the day. It helps me to be most effective with my students and knowing how to reach them better and be prepared to reach them all. I think it helps them to know what is coming and to feel like their teacher is prepared and those kinds of things. I think that consistency is important, and also just going with the flow. If your students are enjoying their time on a certain part of your lesson plan, don't be afraid to extend it longer than you had planned. If they're benefiting from it, I think it's important to